Ancient history, lesson 17, the first intermediate period of Egypt is our topic for the day. And once again, in Egypt, you have Upper and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt is actually southern Egypt, and Lower Egypt is actually northern Egypt. Obviously, as you get closer to the Mediterranean, this is closer to sea level, and this is somewhat higher elevation. And also, it's upriver is where we get the Upper Egypt from, and downriver is where we get Lower Egypt from. So those are the two things to keep in mind about the way Egypt looks. Memphis is where we have the capital in the Old Kingdom, which is the period we just finished, and it will remain the capital for the early part of this this period that we call the first intermediate period for roughly the first half. But then we'll see later in the lesson today that the city of Hyrcanopolis, try saying this three times fast, Hyrcanopolis is the capital during the ninth and 10th dynasties. So between the 8th and ninth dynasties, the capital will move from Lower Egypt in Memphis to Hyrcanopolis in Upper Egypt. At least that's the story of Manthos. I think that we're going to see some evidence today that the seventh and eighth dynasties in Memphis and the ninth and 10th dynasties in Hyrcanopolis might actually have overlapped. It might not actually have been in succession, but the seventh and eighth dynasties themselves might be intermingled in our histories, and in the ninth and 10th dynasties may have actually overlapped. What we might really be seeing here is a divided Egypt again. Um, and we'll talk more about that as we get into it. Um, so we are coming to this period, the first intermediate period. Of course, the dates are always in dispute. Was it really 2125? Well, it depends on which historian you ask. If you're asking me, I'm going to say no, probably not, but I don't think it's that far off. Um, and we are talking about the kingdom in between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. Okay, so why do we have these time periods called the Intermediate Kingdom or intermediate periods? There are 33 dynasties of Egypt's long story arc, and they are divided into kingdom eras as Old, Middle, and New. And then after that, the Ptolemaic period and the Greco Roman period. So, really, five different kingdom eras: the Old, the Middle, and the New Kingdoms, the Ptolemaic period, and then the Greco Roman period. But over that time, 33 different distinct family lines or dynasties of kings in a united Egypt. So when we talk about the intermediate periods, then, is that each of these kingdom areas is distinguished by a destabilization period where the central government destabilized and the unified national power collapsed. Okay. So in between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, something happened that caused essentially everything to fall apart in Egypt. And between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, something happened that caused everything to fall apart again. And that's what we mean by intermediate periods, these periods of unstable, non unified Egyptian history. These periods of time are then called the intermediate periods between times of stable government, and I would say stable unified government. Um, any questions about that? What the intermediate period means then? Okay, so let's talk about the first intermediate period then. It's often described as a dark period. In Susan Bauer's book, she says of this time period, for a century and a half, Egypt had no pharaoh worthy of the name. Okay. The first intermediate period is kind of a dark ages of ancient Egypt in a sense, and it's not the last one, and it's not the first one, but it is a short-lived dark ages that last a little over a century, 125 to 150 years, depending on who you are asking. The term first intermediate period is a fairly recent one, though. Um, a lot of times we use these terms um, old, middle, and new kingdom, and first and second and third intermediate period, as if that's just what they're called, right? As if they always have been. Well, Manthos is the one who gives us the 33 dynasties, but the terms that we use are actually fairly recent. The concept of a first intermediate period actually goes back to 1926. An Egyptologist by the name of George Steindorf, and another Egyptologist he worked with named Henry Frankfurt. And they gave us this idea that there had to have been a period in between the old kingdom and the new kingdom, and that this was a destabilized period, dark ages in Egyptian history. There's very little evidence from this period in the monuments, what we call monumental evidence. We don't have a lot of statuary from the first intermediate period. We have some, but not a lot. It was a time when things were changing. Okay. It seems that the rule of Egypt was equally divided between the two competing power bases, the one in Hierapolis and in Lower Egypt, and of course up in the Fayum region is where you'll find uh, Heracleopolis, and in the south, in Thebes, in Upper Egypt, was the other power base. Um, During this time, it seems that there was a spiritual dark ages as well, because it appears that the artwork had been destroyed and the temples were ravaged and pillaged and vandalized. The statues of the kings were destroyed and they were denigrated and they were mistreated. Um, these kingdoms, the upper and lower, would eventually come into conflict with each other, and at times open war would even break out. They would eventually they would eventually lead to a conquest of the northern Lower Egypt by the Theban kings, which would lead to the reunification of Egypt under Mentuhotep II during the second part of the 11th dynasty, which is considered the beginning of the Middle Kingdom period and the end then of the first intermediate period. Um, but in order to truly understand the first intermediate period, we have to ask the question, well, what in the world happened to the old kingdom, right? I mean, for hundreds of years with multiple dynasties, the old kingdom is just kicking along. I mean, Teddy's dynasty lasts over 100 years. It's number 6 in the list. How in the world does this become the end of such a long-standing, unified civil government? Why do we say it stops here, and what caused it to stop? Um, the answer is at the University of Memphis, all of the professors of history got together and said to the headmaster, "Don't you think it's about time we named a new period of history?" And so they had a vote and decided on, let's call the new period of history the first intermediate period. No, of course, it didn't really happen that way. Um, what happened was the kingdom fell apart. And we have a pretty good idea what caused it to fall apart. And interestingly enough, it doesn't seem to have been bad leadership. although it's always arguable, right? Um, if you if you ask a Democrat, a Republican is a bad leader. If you ask a Republican, a Democrat is a bad leader. In many cases, they're not necessarily bad leaders. You just don't like their policies, right? I mean, you could make the argument that uh, Bill Clinton was a good leader if all you're looking at is how well did he accomplish what he was trying to accomplish. But if you want to say uh, we're going to take his ideology and his policies and examine them for their value, well, now that's subjective. And this side's going to say he's a terrible leader, and this side's going to say he's an awesome leader, right? But if you're just looking objectively, I think the last kings of Teddy's dynasty, the sixth dynasty, were not lousy kings. They were sitting at the table playing a very bad hand that they were dealt. And whose fault was it? I think you're going to have to blame the Nile River. A 2 centuries long drought in Africa led to no annual flooding of the Nile for a period of 50 years. So try to imagine your entire culture and economy have grown up around the Nile because it floods every year, which brings, rich soil into your fields. It replenishes the nutrients because it brings them up from the river, and it replenishes your fields, and you have lush agriculture as a result. This is why Egypt is where Egypt is, because of the Nile. But in Africa, there was a 200-year drought around this time, not enough water. And something actually happened that the Egyptians could not recall happening before. For not 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, but for 50 years, the Nile was not overflowing its banks. There was no seasonal flooding, and the soil began to be less and less fertile and less nutrient rich. And as a result, the people began to starve. Now, when you're Pharaoh and you're the living God, and part of the job of the living God, Pharaoh, is to control the supernatural world and the forces of nature so that the rains come when they're supposed to, and the sun shines when it's supposed to, and the flooding comes, but it doesn't come too much. And it's your job as the living God to prevent those things from happening. There's an erosion of the public trust. I like to liken it today to the fallacy in a free market economy like the one in the United States that says the primary influence on the economy being good or bad, bullish, bearish, um, or whatever, is governmental policy. In fact, I would say the argument is fundamentally flawed. If a free market is working the way a free market is supposed to, almost nothing the government does should have impact on the economy. Of course, no system is ever 100% free or 100% controlled. It's always a it's always a spectrum, right? Yes, it is true that raising taxes, lowering taxes, raising interest rates, lowering interest rates, opening up natural resources or limiting them can have economic impact. But for the most part, the economy and agriculture are at the whims of things that are far beyond control of mortal men, right? Um, Droughts are hard to fix. and rivers drying up because of droughts are hard to fix. And so this is the kind of thing that led to the collapse of the sixth dynasty and therefore the fall of the old kingdom. All right. Um, it's often described that the period of the fall of the old kingdom is a period of chaos and disorder, but I don't think that that's necessarily always accurate. I think when you look at the data, when you look at the evidence, what you really see is that there are a lot of factors, but we we really can see that the long reign of Pepi II toward the end, the last major pharaoh of the sixth dynasty, was all that was holding the empire together. He was a very popular, very old ruler who had ruled since he was a child, and he ruled possibly into his 90s. So you're talking about a reign that was as much as 80 or more years, possibly 90. And this guy outlived most of his anticipated heirs. He lived so long that his sons were dying, and that created succession problems. Thus, without a clear heir and without a clear succession plan, in the midst of this ecological and economic crisis, the king dies and there's no real plan to go forward. And the regime, the government that was built around him, begins to disintegrate and fall apart. Another thing that was creating a problem was that as the king was aging, what do you do when you're getting old? And hypothetically, let's say you're the leader of the one of the most powerful countries in the world, and you begin to experience physical and mental decline. Try to imagine that you're in that situation as a people. Would it be reasonable to think that more of the decisions would start being made by others rather than the king? Would you think it's possible that that could happen?
We could ask the Biden administration how that works.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of that. No, but here's what happened in ancient Egypt. Without regard to
Okay,
any,
Kevin.
without regard to any current activities in the world in which we live, uh, here's what happened. The people known as the nomarchs, the governors over the nomes, the regions, the provinces, if you will, of Egypt were known as nomes, and the rulers over the nomes are called nomarchs. The nomarchs began to become more and more powerful and more affluent because they were more and more powerful the older that Pepe II got. And you can imagine when Pepe died, the last thing they wanted was, one of his brats or grandchildren or, nephew's cousin's boyfriend's sister-in-law to come to the throne and try to take that power back away from them. So this was a problem. And what began to happen is the position of the nomarchs even became hereditary. So now it wasn't just the pharaoh who was trying to pass, his crown on to his son or grandson, but the nomarchs themselves had become hereditary. So what happens is you create a a nobility class, right? So you already have the pharaoh and his family. And right below that caste is the caste of the priests of the gods. But now you have another class developing besides the rabble, those poor people nobody cares about. Um, Now you have the nomarchs creating something like an upper middle class in the form of a nomarchy, or as we might say, an aristocracy. Okay, And now they're passing their titles down to their sons. And so it becomes not a meritocracy, but an aristocracy. Um, all of these things are coming together, and war is brewing, or I should say, a problem is brewing, a storm is coming. War you might not see just yet. But the nomarchs actually begin raising their own armies. So try to imagine you have a united kingdom under one pharaoh, but all your local provincial governors, your nomarchs, they each get to raise their own military. How long do you think it'll be before those armies start being turned on each other? You know, it's not just defending the southern border gnomes against the Canaanites, or the northern border, excuse me, against the Canaanites, or the western boundary against the marauders, uh, from the Indus Valley. It's not just about guarding against Nubia. Now these nomarchs are going to start fighting with each other. Okay. Um, Inevitably, war broke out between the provinces. Um, as a result, the centralized kingships um, is a uh, is stated as a reason for why the Nile is having such a problem. The the people begin to say, "Why are the gods angry? Why are they denying us water? Why is our beloved Nile, the source of life, drying up?" And they said, "It's because the Pharaoh's power is dissolving." And the Pharaoh is the avatar of the gods who keeps the natural order in balance for Egypt. So it was complicated, but it became inevitable. The drier climate, the lower crop yields, famine across the land, it was inevitable that eventually this old kingdom was about to collapse. And from the fall, from the ashes, if you will, of the old kingdom, we have the mythical Dynasty 7. Assuming the seventh dynasty of Egypt actually did happen, um, and it's not a myth, we have to resolve the ages old question: was it 70 kings in 70 days, according to Africanus, or only 5 kings in 75 days, according to Eusebius? Both of them were reading from the manuscripts of Manetho, as was Flavius Josephus, but for some reason, we can't read those manuscripts because we've lost them. Odd that that would be the case. But Africanus and Eusebius disagree on how many days and how many kings. I suspect that neither one is correct. I think the 70 kings in 70 days or 5 kings in 75 days is probably uh, Manethos was making some liberties, and he was really talking about how the various nomarchs were claiming their superiority and their supremacy, and these skirmishes between them is what they're talking about. I do think that there was a Dynasty 7. I think that Dynasty 7 and Dynasty 8 probably somewhat overlapped. And I think that some of the kings attributed to Dynasties 8 and 9 are actually kings from the 7th dynasty. We don't know a lot about these rulers. What we do know is that some of their names, um, well, most of their names, assuming there were very many of them, are lost entirely to history. Um, there is, however, some hope for the seventh dynasty. A few artifacts have been found, including some scarabs that have been attributed to King Neferkarari the second, not the first, but Neferkarari the second, who was one of the recorded kings of the seventh dynasty. There's a jasper cylinder that appears to have been either Syrian or Syrian influenced, which has been found that is credited to the eighth dynasty. So we do begin to see that um, there are some artifacts that distinguish between the two. Also, there's a small pyramid that it is believed was constructed by King Ibi of the 8th dynasty, and we found it at Saqqara. So while very little is known about the 7th or 8th dynasties, we're beginning to find pieces that we can use to fill in the gap. Um, Several kings during this time period of the 7th and 8th dynasties, such as one whose name is Lishenyu, are only attested once and their position remains unknown. We don't know when they were king, who came before, who came after. We're only guessing. Okay. So I think it's important that as we're guessing, that we acknowledge that we're guessing. Doesn't that seem like it would be kind of an important thing to do? Um, During the time of political fragmentation, when the kingdom collapses, then out of that collapse comes this Dark Ages period. And I think that it would be inappropriate to dismiss the seventh dynasty, but I think we should wait more information before we get too dogmatic about what we think happened. I will go back to my previous hypothesis. I think the seventh and eighth dynasties were active in Memphis. I'm sorry, the sixth and seventh dynasties were active. No, I am getting all tangled up in the dynasties, aren't I? The seventh and eighth dynasties in Memphis were active concurrently with the Hierakonpolis empires of the ninth and tenth dynasties in Upper Egypt, and that's why I think there's so much confusion about them. Also, it was a period where not a lot of good records were kept, and it was many, 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 many thousands of years ago now. So, bearing those things in mind, let's talk about the eighth dynasty for a moment. In the eighth dynasty, Manetho tells us there are 17 kings, and there are some kings lists that also mention 17 kings, but some may say there have been fewer than 17 and some more. Some of the 17 kings of the 8th dynasty are actually 7th dynasty rulers, perhaps, which may have been contemporaneous with the 8th. But the last and most famous was, well, actually, none of them are all that famous. And we don't even know the name of the last one for sure. All we know is that Dynasty 8 came and went in something of a blur. Um, some people then will say that actually Dynasty 7 and 8 should be considered the end of the Old Kingdom, and the intermediate period begins with Dynasty 9. It's certainly a matter of opinion, but my suggestion would be, since we define an intermediate period as a time in between two stable periods, you can't get more unstable than we're not even sure the seventh dynasty existed, right? I'd call that pretty unstable. So I'm going to remain with the old guard on this and say Dynasty 6, 7, 8, and 9 are the intermediate period. I'm sorry, Dynasty 8, 7, 8, 9, and 10 are the intermediate period, and Dynasty 6 was the end of the Old Kingdom. As we come, though, to the period of time known as Dynasty 9, where Heracleopolis becomes more of the capital, then we have the opportunity to look at some bigger king names. Um, one of whom is Mentuhotep I. And Mentuhotep I was a very important king during this period of time, partly because we actually seem to remember him. It's always it's always a sign of your significance if people don't forget you, right?
That does help.
Yeah. Supposedly, the Ninth Dynasty has 13 or 14 rulers, some of whom have names we do not know. They ruled in this dynasty from their new capital in Lower Egypt. I'm sorry, in Upper Egypt rather than Lower Egypt. And the most famous of this dynasty was Imhotep at the very end. But second only to Imhotep would have been Mentuhotep the first. All right. So after more than 20 years of chaos, there appears to have been the line of kings that makes up the ninth and 10th dynasties. These are the kings of the south, and they seem to have been able to take control over the delta. And it is not clear at all if they ever held Upper Egypt. It seems that all of their attempts failed. And so as a result, um, they they were somewhat centered around Thebes. They were more of a regional dynasty in that sense. Um, it's also possible that their kingdom at times extended down to the First Cataract and up to just south of Abydos, but there were also times when the control of Heracleopolis and Thebes was very narrow. Um, one of those times was when Thebes, led by Nedheptahfer Mentuhotep I, conquered Heracleopolis after a period of a few years. And it was then at this time when Mentuhotep I conquered Heracleopolis that we say this is the end of the first intermediate period. And so begins the Middle Kingdom. So, with that overview, let's just take a look at some of the few things that we do know. The dynasties 7 and 8 were short lived, and they seem to have been chaos. Kingships lasted very short periods of time, sometimes perhaps even days, and who these kings were remains a mystery. And some of them are probably names listed with the kings of the ninth and 10th dynasties. I certainly think that they were probably uh, they probably were actually contemporaries. Seventh and eighth dynasties in the north, and the ninth and 10th dynasties in the south, but the seventh and eighth dynasties simply didn't last very long. Um, according to uh, many Egyptologists, however, um, the eighth dynasty should be considered part of the Old Kingdom. I just happen to think they are wrong. As we're talking about the first intermediate period rulers, um, we we know, for example, that Mentuhotep the first ruled, and we know that Intef the first ruled, and Intef the third ruled. Obviously, it seems likely that Intef the second also ruled during this time, but there are those who suggest that maybe he didn't. Mentuhotep II, of course, was the end of the line. All right. Um, but let's talk about Actos. Actos and Mentuhotep I. According to some, Actos is considered to be the king of both the ninth and 10th dynasty. In many books, he's kind of he crosses over. Uh, Actos is also called Nebtikari Actoi. In the tale of the eloquent peasant, a peasant is robbed by a noble. The peasant then takes his plea for justice to the highest court of the land, the court of Nebkari Aktoy. Aktoy was so impressed by the speech the peasant gave that he asks the peasant to tell it over and over again. Thenceforth, the peasant found justice, and the king was pleased. So, who is this Actos? Well, he's a little known king of a dark age who has a few stories told about him. As to Mentuhotep I, he ruled for about 39 years during the 11th dynasty. So his legacy in the time period of the end of the first intermediate period is that he was really the ruler who brought order and stability back to the kingdom. He brought Egypt back together again. Um, as we talk about then the first intermediate period, I think that we need to spend some time talking about what was happening with the nomarchs during this period. Okay, um, the south of Egypt was under the rule of nomarchs who were acting as warlords. The most famous warlord nomarch of the first intermediate period was a regional governor by the name of Ankh Tifi. Ankh Tifi, whose tomb was discovered in 1928 at Moala. So this is a guy who was the nomarch of the nome based at Hierakonpolis. Hierakonpolis is the capital of the empire, and he is the nomarch of that region. Obviously, then, he has a very powerful position. He expanded to the south and conquered a second nome centered on Edfu. Now, try to imagine this. Within the kingdom of Egypt, you now have regional governors conquering each other. He then tried to expand to the north to conquer the nome centered in Thebes, but he lost that fight. But interestingly enough, he has a highly decorated tomb, and in that tomb there is an extremely informative autobiography. Autobiography, meaning that he apparently wrote his own life story and had it painted into pictures um, in his tomb. There's also pictures of Egypt, and the pictures of Egypt show people who are hungry and famished. It says, though, that Antifi had rescued the people. And in his autobiography, he says, I gave bread to the hungry and did not allow anyone to die. So everyone, obviously in the whole world, must have started moving to this nome of Egypt because he didn't allow anyone to die. So you clearly would want to live there because you would never die. The economic disaster in this area is still debated by commentators and historians today, but every ruler at the time is making similar claims. There was famine, there was disaster, there were no crops, but they fed the people. During this time, there was no higher power, there was no clear pharaoh, and these warlords simply decided to go into business for themselves. Egypt as a nation had died. Then came the Theban kings. The Theban kings are the ones who brought order back to the chaos and restored the kingdom. Some interesting things. The later document known as the Ipuwer Papyrus, which uh, is actually titled The Lamentations of or Admonitions of Ipuwer by Ipuwer himself. Many people actually think that the time period that he's writing about was this Dark Ages period known as the First Intermediate period. Another interpretation, that one that I lean toward, is that Ipuwer is actually describing the events hundreds of years later during the time of Moses and the Exodus. But it is important to note that some believe that the Ipuwer Papyrus is referring to the Dark Ages of the First Intermediate period. Okay. Um, it would explain a lot about the time period if it is true, but it's kind of one of those circular arguments. We don't know much about what was going on in the um, first intermediate period, but we think the Ipuwer Papyrus talks about bad times, and these seem to be bad times. So maybe the Ipuwer Papyrus is actually describing this, and because of that, that confirms what the Ipuwer Papyrus says. It's a circular argument. I don't know for sure what time period Ipuwer was writing about. He does seem to have been writing after the time period, but I do think the description fits far better with the Exodus than it does with the first intermediate period. But that's just my opinion. It wouldn't be a period of Egyptian history if there was not some architecture to discuss, right? So we're going to talk about the first intermediate period. We should probably talk about what the Masons, no, not the Freemasons, the stone cutters and stone builders were building. Generally, you could say that with the period, with this period of time, Egypt being divided once again into north and south, upper and lower, um, you could say that this time period, you're going to see some differences in architecture, and that's exactly what we do see. Okay, you'll see that the Memphites they had their own artistic traditions, which had been in place through most of the Old Kingdom, and that they remained during this time period. However, the Theban kings isolated from Memphis, began to have their own versions of art, their own versions of architectural style, and they began to do their own different forms of architecture and art that we can still see remnants of. We don't know a lot about the style of the art from the north at Heracleopolis because not much is known about those kings. So little information is provided. Reliefs from the pre-unification Theban style of art consist of high raised relief or a sunk relief with incised details. So in other words, they're carving into a stone or a piece of clay. Okay. Um, there is a limestone stela from the reign of Mentuhotep II at the very end of this period, at the very beginning of the New Kingdom age, that shows Maitai seated at an offering table with a jar of sacred oils, and he's surrounded with references and other figures from his life. So the treasure of his kingdom, Bebi, is there. And Bebi is actually the ancestor of the Intef family that will come later. So interesting artwork from this period of time. Um, During this time, there is a limestone statue of the steward, Mary, interesting that a surviving statue is not that of a king. There is the limestone stela of Chutchi, and there's another one that we don't even know a title for that just seems to be of a random woman. Um, the thing that probably most marked the period is food shortages. Hungry people are unhappy people. Uh, if you've ever been at church camp when the stove broke down, you know exactly what that means. Hungry people are unhappy people. There are texts from the time period that suggest that the abrupt climate change led to frequent famines and that the nomarchs really did take a leading role in bringing emergency food supplies. They took control of the management and conservation of the food that they had, and they brought the best engineers in to try to manage the water in the best way that they could. It is interesting that in the midst of all of that, they still managed to have time to go to war with each other when they were supposedly so busy feeding their people. Um, Here's probably the biggest takeaway that I get when I look at the first intermediate period. We can't find hardly any evidence of any action taken on the part of the central government. In all the local affairs, it seems that it is the warlords, the nomarchs, who are in charge, and none of them seem to be acting out on orders of the king. So the boastful um, statements in their autobiographies of the nomarchs may have been overstated, but it doesn't seem that they were inaccurate. They really did, in many respects, save the people. There's uh, there's no evidence um, for occasional food shortages. The evidence is for dire conditions. Okay. Um, we also we also see that with the collapse of the old kingdom and the rise of the nomarchs, a new era of Egyptian government is being born. I mentioned earlier that a new class or a new caste in the Egyptian society was growing up, and this caste would not go away as the Middle Kingdom period comes into being. And
Excuse me. I think is are you are you advancing slides? Because
now I just realized my
are
slides were frozen. Okay, um, I've got
are you
uh,
on Dynasty? What I'm seeing Dynasty 10. It just changed to
okay,
Dynasty 10.
yeah. So in Dynasty 10, there were either 18 or 5 rulers. The last one's name is we don't know. Okay, it's literally a blank
Okay.
in Menethos, and that was the last of the slides. So there was only one slide that had not shown, um,
Okay.
and that was actually the slide I was talking about. So I guess it's a good thing you pointed it out. The Dynasty 10, the end of the first intermediate period. Let me get it back up on the screen. Um, One thing I don't care for in the way PowerPoint is set up, if you try to roll past the last slide, it doesn't stop, it shuts off. All right. So either 18 or 5 rulers, and the last one's name is unknown, and then comes the time of the Middle Kingdom. So we have about 8 minutes left, and that really completes the mysterious period known as the First Intermediate Period. I'll share with you a couple of insights from a biblical historian, meaning me. Um, I think the dynasties 7 and 8 are mythologized and sometimes they're called fictitious simply because they actually existed at the same time as dynasties 9 and 10. which is one of the reason why the dates of Egyptian history are so extended because coexisting dynasties overlapped. I believe that some of the rulers that are listed in later dynasties, like 9 and 10, actually are from 7 and 8, and they ruled in the north, not in the south. I believe that it is important to remember that Egyptian chronology is an art form, and that while we're trying to make educated guesses, Egyptologists and ancient historians have been trying to piece these things together for over 130 years, and we're just doing the best we can. Um, and so, for that reason, I would say whenever you're looking at ancient history prior to about the time of Solomon, the dates are often soft, which is one of the reasons why the Bible says history only lasts for so long and secular history seems to extend it longer. Any questions or comments?
It does seem odd that Egypt, when you look at their origin through Cush and through Noah, it is surprising what an impact they have had on world history.
Yes, it is. And it's also interesting to note the theories that exist about perhaps it was actually Mesopotamians who came into ancient Egypt and established the first dynasties, which I think is interesting because, Egyptian lore says that their first king was a god. And so I'm actually curious if we'll someday get evidence that the first king was actually um, the first king was actually the great grandson of Noah. That it was just essentially he himself, Mizraim, actually was the one who ruled over Egypt for a long period of time in its early years.
And very well may have been an informal situation.
Yeah, a patriarchal king.
Yeah.
Um, so one of my life goals is to write a history of the world chronology using the Bible's chronological order as the standard and using common events between the Old Testament and the ancient powers to correct the chronology of Egypt and Greece and Rome and Mesopotamia, as well as Canaan. Um, the problem is, as soon as I publish it, somebody will dig up some artifacts that will immediately make me an idiot. So, you know, history is always a work in progress.
Yes, it
And
is.
next week, we're going to dive into the Middle Kingdom, and that should be a lot of fun. We may bleed the Middle Kingdom over into the Second Intermediate period, and cover some of the Middle Kingdom over 2 days and finish up the Middle Kingdom and the Second Intermediate Kingdom on Tuesday. There's a lot to cover in the Middle Kingdom. So, uh, thanks for your input, and I will see you guys later today
Quick,
in Old
with
Testament.
your PowerPoint, if you can PowerPoint options under advanced, um, and there's a section in there for slideshow. Um, you can tell it to show the menu on the right mouse click, or it will go back up one slide
Hmm.
with the right mouse click. You could also have it end with a blank black slide rather than, so if you advance too far, it goes black
Right.
rather than ending.
Yeah. I know that option is there. I just haven't been in the habit of using it, but I may start because I'm used to using a remote control uh, clicker to advance my slides. But that's harder to do um, in this Discord environment where I'm just basically using multiple screens. So, but yeah, I will look at doing that in the future. All right,
Okay,
gentlemen, have a great chapel and lunch, and I will see you guys in Old Testament in just a little while.
thank you. Thank you.